Welcome. This is a presentation of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia. Our speaker today is Ahkil Reed Amar. He is the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University, and we're going to be discussing today his new book, Born Equal: The Remaking of the America's Constitution from 1840 to 1920. My name is John O'Brien. Along with our moderator, Tom Pete, will be fielding questions after Dr. Amar's presentation. So, Keel, welcome. Glad to have you, and please tell us about Born Equal.
Let me first thank you again and apologize again. Let me second say, since this is a DC group, and since I'm going to be in DC a couple of times over the next several weeks, let me tell you my schedule just in case any of you would like to meet with me individually or collectively. So let me just go over the 2 times I'm going to be in DC over the next month or so. One is next Tuesday, that's June 16th, I believe. Hold on. Yes. June 16th, I'm going to be at Ford's Theater at 7 p.m. And that's in connection. And I think the great Alan Gelzo may be with me at that event at Ford's Theater. Let me just, and then I can confirm that at the end of our session today. And then I'm going to be in DC for a week, talking with high school kids and college kids, especially college kids, as part of the Hertog Foundation, and that's going to be July 6th through the 10th, or at least to the midday on the 10th. And once again, I think Alan Gelzo is going to at least make an appearance for part of that. That's an event all about the Born Equal book. So if you're in DC and interested, maybe we can follow today's Zoom session up with other conversations in person. Just I'm more interested, truthfully, in hearing your questions than in just hearing myself just lecture to you. There's already been one question in the chat, maybe a couple that I will make sure to respond to, but just in a nutshell, by way of reminder, Born Equal is the 2nd volume of a hoped-for trilogy. I think that we Americans don't understand our own identity as well as we should. And by our own identity, I don't mean as South Asian Americans or Italian Americans or Catholics or Jews. I mean as white or black, gay or straight. I mean as Americans. What we have in common, actually, is our Americanness. We don't have in common race or religion or first language or ethnicity, politics, even geography. So unless we actually understand, in my view, our Constitution, our institutions created by the Constitution, and our fathers, to borrow a Lincolnian expression, the people who came before us, who created and revised these institutions, unless then we don't really have anything in common. We can't talk to each other. What we have in common is Abraham Lincoln. And what people in Lincoln's generation had in common was George Washington. And so these books try to tell the story of us, not the story of me. I'll tell you my politics. I'm basically a moderate Democrat. But I hope actually that this book would appeal to people who voted for Trump, who voted for Bernie Sanders. I myself am not a Trump person. I'm not a Bernie Sanders person. I'm not an AOC person. I'm a moderate mainstream Democrat, but that's not the point. The point is not about me, but about us. Um, and if we're going to govern ourselves, we have to talk to each other, and we have to talk to each other about things like the Constitution. Every 4 years, you have to pick a president. Well, you need to understand what presidents do, what past presidents have done. Then you decide for yourself who was good and who was bad and why. And at least one template for that, yardstick, metric, for who was good and who wasn't, is the Constitution itself. Who was faithful to the oath of office? The first thing you're supposed to do as president is to swear to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. I claim Lincoln did. I claim he became president because he actually cared about the Constitution. He was otherwise a nobody from nowhere. Um, and them's fighting words for some folks because they were taught that Jeff Davis was right and secession was a constitutional prerogative. I don't think so. So I'm going to give you the evidence for that, and then we can talk. Okay, and that's why I'm late, because I'm working on volume 3 now, and I just got so absorbed because actually my editor had a good idea for a revision, and I was revising the whole table of contents in light of that. And the new table of contents is going to be much more punctuated around, organized by presidents, because ours is very much a presidential world, in part because we keep getting into these wars. America's more global, and that's going to put more emphasis on the presidency. In my previous books, I don't tell you a lot about James Monroe, don't tell you that much about Martin Van Buren. Definitely in the new volume, tell you next to nothing about Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, William McKinley. I tell you a lot about Lincoln because he's constitutionally significant. I told you a lot about the early presidents because they were constitutionally significant. But in our modern world, which is a world of globalism and wars, and a personalized media where they're beaming themselves into our living rooms via radio, TV, internet, social media. The new book is organized around presidents, or at least it is as of this morning. It wasn't 2 days ago. So that's what I was thinking. Oh yeah, this is actually a better organizing schema. Okay, what do you want to talk about?
People are charmed and delighted by the tack that you've taken with the book. There is some concern among the older folks about the familiarity that you express with some of the characters, but by and large, we appreciate your enthusiasm, your creativity in approaching the questions that we thought we knew about before in a very different way.
Let's talk about the familiarity for just a minute, because a lot of people have mentioned that. There's a review, I think a very silly, truthfully, and ungenerous review in The Nation, which is can be at times a far leftist periodical, by a very distinguished historian who thinks he knows so much more than I do, even though he's never spent a day in law school. And he said that Lincoln, didn't like, Abe. Here's what I can tell you. His stepmother uses that 3-letter designation again and again and again in her interview with Herndon after Lincoln's passing. So, and I think of all the people in the world, the one who loved Abe the most, and perhaps the one whom Abe loved the most, and who had that sort of the most action. And I know he was married, and I know he had a sibling and all the rest, but I think his deepest relationship was with his stepmother, and she says, Abe, Abe, Abe. David Reynolds writes an interesting book. It's entitled Abe. He is in his bones a politician. He loves politics, and he thinks it's noble. He doesn't think it's he's not embarrassed to be a politician. He thinks politics is how we solve problems. He likes people, actually, so he likes politicians and hangs around with them, and he likes politics. And I think Abe is good politics in an informal world. They didn't, I'm trying to tell you something when I said they didn't call him Tom Jefferson. They didn't call him George. He was, General Washington, His Excellency, President Washington. But in a world of hard cider and log cabins, it's Tippecanoe, that guy was William Henry Harrison. He was to the manor born. Okay, but he's presenting himself as, a log cabin kind of guy, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. It was an era of, it was Jacksonian America in which some of the successful politicians very much wanted to present themselves in informal ways. I never call him Fred Douglass because Stephen Douglas called him that, but he never called himself Fred Douglass. He was proud to be Frederick Douglass, so I was, and as I mentioned in the book, it's a little because we have women on the scene now prominently on public stages in a way that we didn't have before. Last names are tricky because Elizabeth changes her last name. She was Elizabeth Cady, and then she becomes Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And men don't change their names over their lives, and so it's a little complicated when someone's, if I use last names, their identity completely changes in the middle of their life because they marry some new man. And even their last names are taken from their fathers or their husbands, so it's a little bit patriarchal. So and finally, I wanted the reader to have a sense that these are people that we can, in this book, that you can get to know. And Abe's friends did call him Abe, and he didn't say, "Call me Mr. Lincoln." And didn't even say, "Call me Abraham." So I think he made himself approachable and would not begrudge someone who has the effrontery to call him Abe, because this person is trying to approach him, that is me, in friendship.
Thank you. And
Professor
Dr.
Amar,
Tom
I hope,
Pete has some of the
yeah,
questions. Go ahead, Tom.
Professor Amar, I do have to say, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining our conversation on your book. But I do have to say, from Herndon's Informants, just a counterpoint, that for
Yes.
every person in Herndon's Informants that calls him Abe, there are probably 100 that call him Lincoln. So, just to provide a little bit of a counterbalance there. Uh, one of the most,
Hold on, hold on, hold on.
okay,
I heard
all right,
that. But wait. No, no, no. Let's have a conversation. I
okay,
told you the following. Okay, you can have 100. I've got Sarah Bush Johnson.
yes.
Okay, so a Smith and Wesson beats four aces. The person who loved him the best called him Abe, Abe, Abe. So
Yes, she
that's
did.
and unless Herndon changed that, and I don't think he changed that, that was significant to me because I love him. And, and
What about Mary Lincoln though? What did Mary call him?
oh, he called her mother, and
Molly.
she, Molly now, and I didn't want to get into that. Michael Burlingame gets into that. Other
Yeah,
folks get into that, and we could
yeah.
talk about, Hellcat and bipolarity and all the rest. And wow, that was complicated. And I think his relationship with Sarah, Bush Johnson was
hmm
the deepest relationship he actually had.
That's
And
a
I
good
thought
point.
about all that when I decided to use Abe.
That's a good point. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Um, I think the first question that everybody wants to know about is, please more fully describe originalist, like
Yes,
yourself and Lincoln, textualist, and strict constructionist interpretations of the Constitution, and briefly their
yes,
histories and who favors which.
yes, great. And by the way, my dear friend Samir just, reminded us all. Yeah, he called her often mother. She called
hmm
him often father. And it is an interesting just reminder. And he was called Father Abraham by lots of other folks too, as a term of endearment. This guy has a not great relationship with his own father, and yet has
Right.
such love for his kids. And so his childhood didn't ruin him. I think Hamilton is impressive because he grows up basically, an orphan. How does a bastard orphan, and yet he wasn't faithful, completely to Eliza, but I think he did genuinely love his wife, and have friends who loved him and came to love him, and not everyone. See, because parents can mess their kids up. We can't guarantee our kids' success. We can't, no matter what we do. We can actually really mess them up. And Hamilton had a messed up childhood, and so did Abe Lincoln. And wow. So I do think it's interesting. They call each other, not husband, not, husband. And some people did refer to their spouses as, husband or, wife, but mother and father. So thanks for that, Samir. Yes. Other, I'm going to be blunt, idiotic reviewers. My book was very, very generously reviewed by Gordon Wood, who in my view is the greatest historian of my lifetime, maybe the greatest American historian. And then there are other people, who wrote other reviews. And it's not that they're critical, it's that they say stupid things. So in the New York Times, this guy, I've never met him, named Jeff Schessel, basically criticizes me for talking about originalism, and Publishers Weekly doesn't like that part of the book. That's because these reviews are written by people who have never spent one damn day in law school. They don't understand what originalism even means. And I know who I am. Okay. I actually graduated first in my class, at a tough law school, and was hired at the age of 26. Here's what originalism means. Yes, the term didn't exist in the 1840s, 50s, 60s. I say that on page 2. The term was actually coined by my co-author, Paul Brest, who disagrees with me. He doesn't like it. I do, but he is my co-author on the casebook that I edit, which is called Processes of Constitutional Decision-Making. So it's a phrase coined in 1980 by Paul Brest in the Boston University Law Review. Here's what it means. It doesn't mean conservative. It doesn't mean liberal. An originalist is someone who prioritizes the text of the Constitution, its general structure, and its purpose, its history, its original intent, if you will. And you say, well, doesn't everyone do that? Yes, I think everyone should, but you guys aren't in law school, most of you, and a lot of my colleagues in law school, I think they're utter idiots, okay? And they have no clue about what constitutional law is. It's just what they want it to be. No, that's not constitutional law. Or if it's not what you want it to be, there are others who are more principled, and they say, well, it's the precedents. So the divide in America, if you are serious about law, and I am, and these reviewers, they've never spent a day in law school. Do you prioritize text, history, and structure, the Constitution, the document, or do you prioritize instead what you think is good policy or what the precedents are? Those are your choices, or you have no clue at all, okay? So no clue at all. I don't know then how you would decide anything, whether you're president or a judge. If it's what you personally think, well, then what are you taking an oath to? I thought it was to the Constitution. If it's the precedents, what are you taking an oath to? It's the Constitution. Lincoln says Dred Scott's bullshit. They made it up. That's what an originalist would say. And an originalist would also say, I'll enforce the Constitution even when I don't like it, but maybe we should amend it. That means you're an originalist, and you can be a liberal or conservative. Now, the greatest originalists I claim of all, and I know what it looks like because this is what I do every day, is constitutional law. And Jeff Schessel doesn't do that. Okay. So I'm telling you why, because there are reviews out there why some are intelligent and some are stupid because they don't even know. So you're asking just the right question. Why, Abe? because I love the guy, as Sarah did, and he didn't mind, the informality. He thought it was politically advantageous for people to feel connected to him. That's an advantage, rather than to be, perceived as too aloof. And why originalism, which is, the second page, because that's actually who he is. You can't read the Cooper Union address if you're a con law person and not be struck like, wow, he's just making all sorts of arguments about what the framers and the signers originally were trying to do. Those are totally originalist moves. He's not appealing merely to the cases. He's not simply saying, here's what I think is good policy, because as a matter of policy, he hates sending fugitive slaves back, to their stripes. He says that in a letter to Speed. He says, I hate this. Okay, but I bite my tongue or something, hold my tongue, bite my lip, because that's what the Constitution actually requires. So this is what you've been taught, and it's wrong. You've been taught that the great originalists today are Antonin Scalia. I have his book right here. And Antonin Scalia posed as an originalist, but he didn't really know enough history. This is his book. See how slender it is? And only about a third of it is what Scalia did. It's a little lecture that he gave at Princeton. It's mainly about statutory interpretation. It's maybe 40 pages, but a third of it's about the Constitution. And then he got 4 people to respond to it. The great Gordon Wood, who just passed away last week, Larry Tribe, Ronald Dworkin, and a woman named Mary Ann Glendon. They wrote responses. He responded to their critique, and then there's some other materials. This is the posthumous edition. It has a new preface. The preface is written by me. Okay. And here's what I say about Scalia in footnote. And I said, I will not write the preface unless I get to say what I really want. If not, get someone else to do it. And they said, no, we want you. More generally, footnote 8. Scalia failed to read modern original scholarship that conclusively disproved many of the historical canards that were prominent in the 1950s when he attended law school. How can one be a serious originalist without doing the necessary historical homework? He didn't. He just called himself an originalist, but he was a poseur, okay? And Lincoln did the work. Read Cooper Union. My God, he did the work, and he did have the internet. The great originalists today are not even Clarence Thomas, who is a reader. Scalia wasn't. But not Bork, who was my teacher. Bork didn't read very much. Scalia didn't read very much. Thomas does read a ton, and that's why he has sometimes crackpot ideas, crackpot as seen by the mainstream media, because he's not always following the precedents. But I need to be straight with you. To be an originalist, to be a serious originalist, you actually have to do the work. Justices can't do that. They have day jobs. They have to decide environmental law and administrative law and employment law. They've got all sorts of things. They can't be experts on the Constitution. They can't spend years of their lives studying it in general. Lincoln did, and he's astonishing for having done that. Okay, but the original, so the greatest originalist of all time are people who really studied the Constitution and followed it. John Marshall, pretty impressive originalist. Joseph Story wrote a 3-volume. I have it right up here in my on my shelf here. So these are 3 volumes. The Joseph Story, the greatest associate justice of the Supreme Court of the 19th century, kind of John Marshall's right hand. 3 volumes about the history of the Constitution. A lot of scholarship there. He was the Dane professor at Harvard, or founded the modern Harvard Law School. You have to be a scholar typically to do this. What's astonishing about Lincoln is he's self-taught and did all this scholarship. So originalists are, and whether you're liberal or conservative, just you privilege the Constitution over the cases, or over your personal preferences. They are Marshall, story, Lincoln, and then, and this is the new book that I'm working on now, in my lifetime, in our lifetime, the greatest originalist on the bench was Hugo Black, who always carried a pocket constitution around with him, who was quite Lincolnian in that he was self-taught and underestimated. Lincoln had no formal education practically, and the East Coast elites, thought he was a bumpkin. So too with Hugo Black. He spent 2 years at, a law school that it wasn't, particularly prestigious, Alabama. But like Lincoln, he just went studied in the library and learned a ton and privileged the Constitution. He was a liberal, was Hugo Black. He was Franklin Roosevelt's first appointment to the court. Okay. And I'm not a modest person. Lincoln was modest, and it's amazing. Lincoln was honest and modest. I'm honest, but I'm not modest. The originalist today would be me, because I've written 8 books and they're not about my politics and they're not about the cases, because the justices are often stupid. My brother clerked for Harry Blackmun, who wrote Roe versus Wade, and I'm pro-choice, but Roe versus Wade is not a persuasive opinion because it doesn't actually do a good job explaining the text of the Constitution and the history of the Constitution. So I'm pro-choice, but I'm not pro-Roe versus Wade because it's not about whether I like the result. Originalism is someone who privileges the Constitution even over the precedents, and that's classic Lincoln. He says, yeah, they said this in Dred Scott, but they made it all up. So he's criticizing the cases. That's what an originalist does. An originalist believes that presidents can read the Constitution just as courts can, that ordinary citizens can read it. That's what an originalist is. And now, just to sum up, the greatest originalists of all time, many of us have been left of center, actually, in our era. Lincoln, Hugo Black. Here's truly the greatest originalist president was Lincoln. The greatest originalist justice was FDR's first appointee, Hugo Black. And the originalist scholar who's written 8 books about the Constitution is speaking to you now. We're all left of center. This guy was a poser. He didn't do the work. Wark was a poser. He was my teacher. I liked him, in that I wasn't an originalist before I took his class, and I pushed back hard, but I came to realize, yeah, he's got a point. If you take an oath of the Constitution, you should be implementing the Constitution. So that's but ordinary people think originalism means conservatism. And that's not true. Originalism, there are liberal precedent people. Today, that's Elena Kagan. In the Warren Court, that was William Brennan. There are conservative precedent people. That's the second Justice Harlan, who was a kind of a traditional conservative. That might be on today's core, conservative precedent person might be William Howard Taft. Now, there are liberal originalists, Abe Lincoln, yours truly, Hugo Black. There are conservative originalists. Today, I would say the great conservative originalist among scholars might be Michael McConnell. He teaches out at Stanford. He's a Republican. Will Bode. He teaches out at Chicago. He clerked for John Roberts. So, but originalism does not mean conservative. It means someone who cares a ton about the Constitution, even if the precedents say something else.
Well, thank you so much for that clarification. I understand it much better now. I remember a speech given by Antonin Scalia in Raleigh, North Carolina, and he said, the Constitution is dead, dead, dead. and don't try and make it anything else. And I know I reacted not well to that statement, even though I understood the perspective that he was coming from. So that clarification. Is there any book that another person had asked me to ask you? Do you have a book that you recommend on originalism other than picking up uh, what you have written? And if you've got a specific book,
Here's one book. It's edited by a friend of mine who was the founder of the Federalist Society, and we co-teach a course every year on originalism. His name is Steve Calabrese, and this is an edited book. He was the founder of the Federalist Society, he's the national co-chair, and it's called Originalism, A Quarter Century of Debate. So you could look at that if you were interested, edited by Steve Calabrese. I have a short little book that includes called The Constitution Today. It brings together op-eds that I've written over the years, about 70 of them. And one set of op-eds are all about originalism, liberal originalism. And if you didn't want to get the book, you could just, all you have to do is just put in Ahkil Amar, liberal originalism, and you'd get links to pieces that I wrote in Slate. One piece I wrote is called Originalism for Liberals. If you even went on my Wikipedia page, and you just search for the word originalism, it would take you to this short little Slate piece. Slate is an online magazine on the left. It's called, I think, Originalism for Liberals. John, I'm going to, at the end of, because if I start pushing buttons, I'm going to actually disconnect myself because I'm stupid this way. But after this session, I will email you a PDF of a longish article I wrote. It's in the Harvard Law Review. It's called The Document and the Doctrine. And those of us who believe in the document are originalists. Those of us who believe in the doctrine are precedent people. Each of these two groups has liberals in it and conservatives, but it's a long piece about how to think about document people versus doctrine people, people who mainly emphasize the case law. So I'll send you a PDF. It's my you could actually, even right now, because it's freely available, you could just Ahkil Amar, Doctrine and Doctrine, a Document and Doctrine. It's a PDF in the Harvard Law Review, and it's a long piece all about how originalists think about things versus precedent people. But I'll also, John, email it to you so you can send around the PDF if that's easier.
Thank you.
And Steve is an originalist, and he's right of center. I'm an originalist, and I'm left of center, and we co-teach together. We've done it every year for the last 14 years. And 90% of the time, we actually agree on what the legal answer is because we play by the same ground rules. I agree that Roe versus Wade is kind of made up, and he agrees that birthright citizenship is in the Constitution, just as examples. Now, originalism, this is a prediction to you all. It's going to be looking a hell of a lot better to all sorts of people on the left in 2 weeks, because in 2 weeks, the Supreme Court is going to rule against Donald Trump on birthright citizenship, and he's going to do it on the basis of the arguments made in Born Equal and in an originalist brief that I filed in that case, and originalist op-eds that I wrote in a thing called SCOTUS blog. So they're going to say, look, maybe it doesn't make sense, okay, but then amend the Constitution. But until we do, here's what it says. Now, Scalia was a provocateur. You see, we academics have to, he was a teacher. It wasn't that much of a scholar, truthfully. But if you're a teacher, you got to keep your students' attention, and they have a teeny tiny attention span. And so you got to be a bit of a showman just to keep them interested. Scalia was a showman, so am I. I have to be. We have to be hams to a certain degree. So he was given to all sorts of provocative formulations like dead, dead, dead. He liked attention for himself. I think that made him a bad justice. Justices are not supposed to be actually, it's not about you. That's why you wear a robe. It's not supposed to be about you at all. But in a classroom, it has to be about you because during shopping period, you got to get them to take your class rather than someone else's class if you're teaching an elective. It's just a different thing, being a judge and being scholar. So he says dead, 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 and that's provocative. Here's the better way of putting that point. In some obvious sense, the document is not organic. It has no DNA. It doesn't, that's the test of whether you actually are living is whether you have DNA or not. It doesn't have DNA. And it doesn't mean it can't change. If you're an originalist, you think the way you change it is by amending it. That was how Lincoln did, not just by ignoring what it says. That's what Trump is trying to do with birthright citizenship. So but to say it that way isn't as exciting. So he wanted to get your attention. He wanted to push your buttons. So he says, dead, dead, dead. I wrote a book called America's Unwritten Constitution. I think there's a written constitution, but there are also unwritten principles like separation of powers, checks and balances, the rule of law. But one chapter is called America's Lived Constitution. There are rights, and they're not all listed. Scalia was shitty on unenumerated rights. The Ninth Amendment says they're not all listed. He couldn't take that seriously. But then which of us is actually taking the Constitution seriously? Justice Scalia, you who says there are no unenumerated rights, or me who says the Ninth Amendment itself says some of the rights aren't listed. So does that mean all bets are off? No, here's what that means. One, if a right is in the Constitution, we protect it, and if we don't like it, we amend it, and Trump thinks otherwise. He doesn't like birthright citizenship, so he's just going to ignore it. And the Supreme Court says, you don't get to do that. And that will be originalism. And these are conservatives who are going to embrace a liberal result. And 2 weeks from now, my prediction is my philosophy is going to look a lot better than it looks today when we win this case based on birth equality. But, so if it's in there and you don't like it, right, you got to amend it out. But if it's not in there, it still might be a right because the Ninth Amendment says the rights aren't all listed, aren't textually specified, aren't enumerated. That's chapter 3 of a book that I wrote called America's Unwritten Constitution. So where do we find unenumerated rights? Because it can't just be making stuff up, because then Tawny could say, well, there's an unenumerated right to carry slaves wherever you go. And an unenumerated right to resist anti-slavery laws or something. And I tell you, here are some ways that we can find unenumerated rights. They're disciplined ways. I'll just give you a couple. It doesn't say so explicitly, but it's implicit. Is there a right to send someone a private letter? Yes, it's not oral speech. It's not freedom of a printing press. But you read speech and press together, and it's really about, you read between the lines, it's about expression, implicit rights. It says, you have a right to confront witnesses against you. Do you have a right to confront physical evidence that's introduced against you? Some fingerprint or something? Well, of course you do. If you can confront a witness against you, of course you can confront physical evidence against you. So one idea is they're implied as well as express rights. But another idea is, if a whole bunch of states recognize a certain right, if a certain right isn't in the Constitution, but it's in the Declaration of Independence, if it's in most state constitutions, that would be evidence it's a fundamental right, even if it's not expressly mentioned in the federal Constitution. But we have to have some rules about, so Scalia, in my view, I'm being very blunt. He was not I don't think about Scalia very much because I actually don't think he was serious. I think he was a poser. He was a carnival barker, and he got a lot of attention. And who's dead, dead, dead? That would be Antonin Scalia. And I don't think he's immortal the way Lincoln is, because Lincoln actually wasn't just, Lincoln had to be a showman too. He was a politician, but Lincoln's ideas are far more worthy of attention than Scalia's. And so I liked him personally well enough. We were friendly. And I was asked to write the preface to the posthumous edition. And wow, I have at him, because I don't think actually you should be thinking about him very much. Instead, what you should be doing is reading my book and then rereading it, and then reading my next book, because my books are serious in a way that Scalia's work was not. And you say, well, what about people on the other side? Oh, read Steve Calabresi's essay, edited volume on originalism. And Steve is an honest person. Read what he says on the back of this book, because this is true. Ahkil Reed Amar is the most accomplished scholar of his age. That's actually true. Okay, age cohort in both law and history, because he writes books like Born Equal, which will change the minds of everyone across the political spectrum, from Federalist Society members. He founded the FedSoc and is the national chair, to Bernie Sanders leftists. Born Equal is one of the most important books ever written, because I'm taking the Constitution seriously and I know my stuff. And Scalia didn't read. And now he's dead. So enough with Scalia.
Did Lincoln
I'm being straight with
make
you
a new
because
constitution?
your time is valuable. We don't, this isn't, a lot of us have gray beards, so we don't have that many years left. So don't waste them on someone who's not worthy of your attention. I'm being straight. Waste
Did
them on
Lincoln make a
someone.
new constitution with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments?
I'm sorry, what about a new constitution in 13, 14,
The
15?
13th and 14th and 15th
Yeah.
Amendments, did they in
Yes.
fact remake the Constitution?
Yes. Yes, that's why the subtitle of the book is Remaking the Constitution. Yeah, this is transformative. You took a structurally pro-slavery constitution and made it radically anti-slavery. Wow, that's astonishing. If you don't see, just 3 words for you, 4 words maybe. President Barack Hussein Obama. Like, that's not possible without 13, 14, and 15. That's a totally different world. Yeah. And great. And none of those are possible without Abe Lincoln. And by the way, the 19th is huge too. Without women's suffrage, Obama wouldn't have won. McCain won among men. So the 19th Amendment is important too. And I see that as actually a Lincolnian amendment. It's building on his ideas, of birthright citizenship. Now, I bring in other people as well, first name basis, especially Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Yes. The Reconstruction amendments are transformed. If you're a Christian, you don't have to be, but if you were, it would be like Old Testament, New Testament. The Gospels and the epistles offer a somewhat different vision than if you just read Torah, or what Christians call the Old Testament. That would be the analogy.
You refer to the broad right that Congress had to now make laws broadly about these concepts that they didn't have before, turning the idea of state rights on its head.
Just so that the original Bill of Rights begins with words, Congress shall make no law. That's the First Amendment. Those first words of the First Amendment, ends with a 10th Amendment about states' rights, celebrate local militias in the Second Amendment. And that's in part because, as Chapter 2 explains, slavocrats are worried about a federal government that might be so powerful that it could eliminate slavery in the states, which it doesn't want the federal government to be able to do. So we go from that to a series of amendments, every one of which ends with the words Congress shall have power. Congress shall have power, 13th Amendment, to smash slavery and all its relics. Congress shall have power, 14th Amendment, to affirm birthright citizenship and enforce these guarantees against states. It says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge. As opposed to Congress shall make no law which shall abridge. 15th Amendment, broad federal power to enforce voting rights racially. 19th Amendment ends broad federal power, congressional power to enforce voting rights when it comes to sexual equality. Broad federal power, just so. That's pretty transformative, because some of the framers of the Constitution were worried about such power because they worried that Congress had virtually plenary power could eliminate slavery in the states, and they weren't for that. And that's where JQA comes in and says, even under the existing Constitution, in one scenario, Congress can act. In order to win a war, Congress can free all sorts of slaves, because the Brits did that with Lord Dunmore and the Revolution, and they did that again in 1812, and countries all across the world have liberated slaves to win wars, just as they've liberated cattle and horses and life and other livestock to win a war.
Thank you. Samir?
Thanks, John and Akhil. Always a pleasure. So, a couple of points that I think you can answer about. One is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, harshly criticizes Mr. Lincoln during the war, and only after he's assassinated, and later when she writes that was uncalled for. Just talk about how Mr. Lincoln, your journey of studying him. The more you read about him, the more you love the man. And we don't need to get into others in history because that will take us on a tangent, although your opinions of those are certainly well-grounded and enjoyable. Just talk about your own journey in being a champion of the Constitution, an originalist, and how your thoughts about Mr. Lincoln have evolved and been refined. And that also parallels others, Of course, Frederick Douglass also very critical of Mr. Lincoln and many. And I think your journey has some parallels, although I know you admired him from the beginning, but to the
Yes.
depth and breadth at this point, that would be, I think our audience would love that.
So I'm not following Lincoln's example, and that's because I'm a smaller person than he is. He was so generous, even to people who unfairly criticized him. And, we've only been talking for 20 minutes. Oh, and I said, and this reviewer was unfair to me about this, and that reviewer was unfair. Okay, Lincoln wasn't like that. He was so much better than that. So he gets slimed all the time, and he just lets it, slide off. And that's a really successful politician, because he realizes, if he responds in kind, then maybe he's he's burned a bridge and he can never, make a connection. Whereas if he responds generously, maybe he can turn current skeptics or critics, enemies, into friends. He always calls people friends. And he wins Douglass over. Douglass is so mean to him at the beginning, says so many unfair things, and Lincoln still embraces him and says, "I know who you are, Mr. Douglass," and leads him, to help free slaves in the South in 1864, which is going to help win the 1864 election. If a whole bunch of people leave the plantations and join the Union Army, that's going to help with Atlanta and the March to the Sea and all that stuff. So Lincoln is really good. And yes, Elizabeth is more small than Abe, and she does criticizes him. And Wendell Phillips calls him the slave hound from Illinois. Really? That's in 1860. That's the key idea, that he's a slave. And we know, because we've read his letters to Speed, he hates capturing, sending, fugitive slaves back. But it's the law, and he's a law person. Okay, that's what originalism actually is. If you don't like the law, you have to change the law, but you can't just ignore the law. And there's an honesty to him. So she can be mean to him. He's never the most liberal person of his era. He's always the most liberal person who can get elected, who has a chance to be elected. And he moves and always in one direction and never slides back. And he never goes back on his word. And he says, having promised freedom to slaves, he says, if I go back on that, I'd be damned, in this life and the next. I'm not going to do that. I've given my word. So he moves from equal freedom to equal citizenship, eventually to even equal voting rights. He's moving in that direction. He would have gone even further had he not been assassinated. So what can we learn from him, Samir? We can learn that he is a politician, and he's attacked on the left as well, from the hard left as well as the right. Okay. But he understands that votes aren't on the hard left. He's got to win the middle. So Joe Biden was spending too much time talking to Bernie Sanders and not enough time talking to Joe Manchin. because the elections are won, by Democrats. If you got a Democrat in West Virginia, that's you got to keep that guy in office, because if he leaves, you're okay. So Biden didn't understand that. He doesn't need Bernie Sanders' vote. He needs votes in the middle. And Lincoln understood the elections are decided in the middle. He dumps Hamlin, for Andrew Johnson, and it doesn't work out perfectly, but he's not the most liberal. He never calls himself an abolitionist. He hates slavery as much as any abolitionist, but he's not going to badmouth the Constitution the way the abolitionists do, and burn it and call it an agreement with hell and a covenant with death, and that there should be no union with slaveholders. He says, yes, there are fellow Americans. We must have a union with them for geostrategic reasons and others. So he's a politician, and he's going to be attacked from the left, but he's always the most liberal person that can get elected. And he moves in one direction. And he's generous to people who criticize him. And I can be catty that way. I should be much more, I should be more Lincolnian here. I was saying, oh, Jeff Schessel wrote a silly thing. But I'm saying that because if I were Lincolnian, if I were, I had more of a sense of humor, I would just say it in a more humorous way. Well, this fellow with his vast, legal experience, that is none. Okay. What we can also learn is how hard it is to be president. And it's so easy to criticize, a president, and Elizabeth does, and Frederick does, and of course, all sorts of other people from a different point of view. Wow, it's not easy to be Franklin Roosevelt, attacked on all sides, or Donald Trump for that matter. It's a very difficult job. I voted against Donald Trump 3 times, but one thing that we can learn about Lincoln, just look at the way he ages. It's, there's death and all the rest, but he's so good at handling criticism, and not, responding in kind. He's generous even to his critics. There's so much to learn from him. And truthfully, I should do better following his example, truthfully. And yes, the more I study him, the more I admire him. That's not true. Jefferson, I began thinking that he was going to be heroic. The more I study him, the more disappointed I became. Washington wasn't great, but he got on slavery, but he got better over the years. Jefferson got worse. Abe Lincoln started out great and gets better and better and better. And he has very few of life's advantages. No family fortune, no family name, no, real education, death all around him. And it doesn't end even in the White House when his favorite son, Willie, dies. Death all around him every day, just dripping from his fingers. And the more I study him, the more I love him, and I want to call him Abe, because he allowed his friends to do that. He never told his friends, "Call me Lincoln." He would refer to him as, Herndon. He called him Speed. But he never, I think, said to someone, "Call me Mr. Lincoln," or something like that. So anyway, there's so much to learn. But here's maybe the final point. We Americans produced him and picked him. I think there are great people today, and we're not doing a good job actually picking them, in part because we don't even understand, like we did this before. Let's actually study really carefully, how we came to elect a Lincoln. FDR had lots of flaws, but wow, he probably was the right man at the right time, and he had gone through a lot. He was to the manner born, but polio and other things had really, given him an appreciation for suffering of others.
We have time for one last question, I think. Tom, Pete, what's the group have to say?
Okay. Born Equal describes the high esteem which the American public held for the founding fathers and the alleged political progeny, Monroe, Madison, JQA Lincoln.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
By what mechanism do you account for this multi-generational transmission of admiration? Reflected
A
glory from the Declaration of Independence or word of mouth from one generation to another?
all of that, a culture, a newspaper culture, a culture of respect for our fathers and what they did, personal transmission belts within families, shared sacrifice, because the third of them might be related to people who, even if they weren't on the battlefields, were suffered during the revolution and 1812. And frankly, the huge success of the American project. They're just, getting all sorts of new lands, and they're the big winners. And compared to all the other parts. But there is this culture of originalism that I say you can see it everywhere. Now, what drives it and what's cause and what's effect, and it's synergistic, but just look, since, you mentioned Madison. Well, there's Madison, Wisconsin or something, or Jefferson. Colorado was originally named for Jefferson. So, every state has at least one location named for Washington, and eventually there's a Washington state. So people naming their children. I give you all these bullet points, just evidence on the stamps, on the coins, in the monument, in the architecture. It is everywhere, and it's Tom, a culture of originalism. This is celebrating our fathers. Now, my thought is our high schools have failed us. They're not teaching history anymore. Our kids no longer, maybe the 1950s textbooks weren't completely honest in identifying America's failures, slavery and the rest. But today they're not learning anything at all. Or if they're learning something, they're only learning from people like Howard Zinn, who identify every one of America's failures. And maybe Zinn was a useful project as a counterbalance to a whitewashed standard narrative or something. But when that's the only narrative that's out there, because there isn't a narrative on the other side, this is a real problem. Our younger generation is dispirited because they're not getting the story of Lincoln's greatness. That's what these books are all about. I'm not trying to hide slavery or sexism or any of that stuff, but I'm also trying to show you, especially if you look at the Constitution, it gets better. We make amendments. They are making amends. The amendments are actually moving us, in favor of more liberty and equality. 13, 14, 15, 19. And the same is going to be true in our lifetime. We get rid of poll tax disfranchisement we let young adults into the process, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. So our Constitution isn't dead, if by that we mean we can't change it. We can. And the changes have generally made us better, not worse. But we need someone to actually tell the story. Here are just like 5 key facts or something. One, more people got to vote on the Constitution than had ever gotten to vote on anything before in human history, and they put it to a vote, which is impressive. 2, the losers acquiesced, and the winners worked with them, and together they created a Bill of Rights. The losers didn't just say it was stolen, and they lost by just this much. But they said, okay, let's, and the winners said, they weren't sore winners, screw you, we won, ha ha. They worked together and added a Bill of Rights. Slavery was the big unfinished business, its gross immorality. And thanks to Lincoln, we get 13, 14, 15, 19, and that's building on the radicalism of the American Revolution, because the world's first abolition movement is born in Philadelphia in 1775, 1776. This is the introduction, with all these state constitutions that say born free and equal. 15 of the and there weren't any free soil colonies in 1775. They were all slave colonies, technically. Fugitive slave rendition, they're all slave states, technically. Okay, there's nowhere to run to. But beginning in 1776, there's an abolitionist project in the world led by Pennsylvania Quakers and Massachusetts Puritans. And by Lincoln's time, 15 of the 19 state constitutions are free soil and 19 free soil constitutions, and 15 saying all men are born free and equal. And that leads to these equality amendments. And then I got my 20th century story still to tell about defeating Hitler and Stalin ultimately, or his successors, and putting men on the moon. And it's a pretty amazing story, but it's not being told. And I'm going to tell you about the bad things too. But we need a national narrative, and we don't have one now that youngsters can so understand what the project has been and why, for all its imperfections, it's pretty darn good compared to anyone else's project in the world. Way better than what the Chinese have been doing.
What will your current project tell us about where we go from here in terms of constitutional law today?
Since 1920, the world is becoming more American, globalization of the world, and the Americanization of the globe, more democracies than ever before, even if imperfect, and the globalization of America. More people who look like Samir and Akhil than ever before. There are democracies in the world, but very few of them bring together the great-grandchildren of all the other continents. And because that's just not true in Norway or Germany or France. So that makes it harder for us because we have less in common than do, the French or the Norwegians, because we're, every religion and no religion, tons of first languages, different skin colors and national origins and ethnicities. It's harder for us. So what we have is each other, our national narrative, but it's not being well told. And Scalia says he's an originalist. Well, then tell us something about America's origins. Actually do the damn work. If you're not going to write a good book, at least read some books. And he didn't do any of that. That's my criticism of Scalia. Not that he's an originalist, but that he didn't do the work. And when you do the work, yes, this remaking of the Constitution has to be central to the story, because the original Constitution was, in certain respects, they were ashamed of slavery. They didn't use the word, but it was pro-slavery. The 3/5 clause means that, slave states are getting extra votes. Without 3/5, actually, you wouldn't have had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. That passes only because of 3/5. And Lincoln hates that fact. But he says, it's in the Constitution, so we have to deal with it. But he's eventually trying to work to a world where we don't have slavery anymore. That's a real remaking of the system. But we need a national narrative. We need a narrative that says no country ever produced anyone greater than Abraham Lincoln or nearly as great. This country actually did first produce and then pick the greatest political figure in the last 200 years. It really did. That's not just a fiction, a fable. That actually happened. Now, can we do it again? How? Let's start by action. Yeah, that's the challenge.
That's all the time we have today. I thank you very much, Ahkil Reed Amar. The book was Born Equal, reminding people that we do more of these events, and you can find out about the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia by going to lincolnian.org and learning more about us and perhaps participating in these events going forward. Thank you, Ahkil Reed Amar.